The town of Crestwood was usually a quiet place where people knew one another and crime rarely made big news. On most nights, the streets emptied early, and the only spots still open were a few diners and gas stations. One of those diners sat on the edge of Main Street, its neon sign flickering softly as a small group of people inside enjoyed late-night meals. It was just after 11 when the door suddenly swung open, and Chief Ronald Harker, the most powerful man in the local police department, marched in with 2 officers at his side. His presence instantly changed the atmosphere. Conversations stopped, forks clinked on plates, and heads turned toward him. Everyone in town knew who he was. For years, he had ruled the department with a heavy hand, and though he had the uniform and the title, many whispered that he enjoyed power a little too much. At a corner booth sat a young man and woman, barely in their 20s, still wearing the glow of excitement from the concert they had just attended. They were eating burgers and fries, laughing quietly to themselves. The chief's eyes locked on them the moment he entered. He didn't greet the cashier or anyone else in the diner. Instead, he walked straight to their booth, his boots echoing on the tile floor. Without explanation, he pointed at the young man and said in a harsh voice, "Stand up." The young man, surprised, looked up. "Excuse me, sir. Did I do something wrong?" he asked politely. His voice wasn't defensive, only confused. The woman sitting across from him looked nervous, clutching her purse tighter. Chief Harker leaned over the table, his face only inches away. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "Stand up, now." The young man obeyed, though his hands shook a little. He had been raised to respect the law, but nothing in his short life had prepared him for this kind of aggression over a simple meal. The chief grabbed his arm roughly, turning him around as if he were already under arrest. The other customers in the diner shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. One older man whispered, "What's going on? That boy didn't do anything." The young man, struggling to keep calm, asked in a steady but nervous tone, "Am I under arrest, sir? Do I have the right to remain silent?" The chief's eyes narrowed, and a mocking smile spread across his face. "Your right to remain silent means nothing here," he said, his voice booming across the diner. "When I say speak, you speak. When I say move, you move. That's how it works." Gasps filled the room. The waitress, who had been refilling coffee cups moments earlier, froze mid-step. 2 teenagers sitting at the counter exchanged shocked looks and quickly pulled out their phones to record what was happening. The woman in the booth stood up, her voice trembling. "Please, he hasn't done anything. We were just eating dinner." But Chief Harker ignored her, tightening his grip on the young man's arm. The arrogance in his tone made it clear he wasn't just enforcing rules, he was enjoying the power he held in that moment. The young man didn't resist, but he tried once more to speak up. "Sir, I don't understand. Please tell me what I did wrong." Harker scoffed. "You think this is a courtroom? You think you get to demand answers from me? You'll find out when I decide you need to know." The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Everyone was used to the chief being strict, but this was different. This was personal. This was a man showing off his authority, not protecting the peace. One brave customer, a middle-aged woman sitting by the window, spoke up. "Chief, this isn't right. We all saw them, they were just sitting here eating. You can't just drag him out like that." Her voice carried a mix of fear and determination. Harker turned his head slowly toward her, his glare sharp enough to silence the room again. "You want to spend the night in a cell too?" he barked. The woman shrank back into her seat, but she didn't put her phone away. She held it steady, recording every second. Others followed her example. Within minutes, at least 4 phones were capturing the scene from different angles. The young woman from the booth, tears brimming in her eyes, tried to hold onto her friend's other arm. "Please, don't hurt him. He hasn't done anything. One of the officers behind Harker shifted uneasily, glancing at his chief, but said nothing. He looked like he wanted to speak but feared the consequences. Everyone knew Harker's reputation. If you crossed him, your career in Crestwood's police department was finished. The chief jerked the young man toward the door, muttering about making an example. The young man stumbled, nearly losing his balance, but managed to steady himself. As they passed through the diner, people's eyes followed them, some in fear, others in anger. The waitress whispered, "This isn't going to end well," as she clutched her coffee pot tightly. Outside, the night air was cool, and the neon sign flickered behind them. Harker shoved the young man against the side of a patrol car. "Hands on the car," he commanded. The young man obeyed, trying not to shake too visibly. His heart pounded in his chest, not from guilt but from disbelief. How could this be happening in his own town, in front of so many witnesses? Inside the diner, whispers turned into hushed conversations. "Did you hear what he said?" "That rights don't mean anything here," one man asked. Another replied, "I got it all on video. This is going online tonight." People were no longer just scared, they were angry. They had all heard the stories about the chief, about his temper and his arrogance, but never had they seen it this clearly displayed in public. Tonight, his words had gone too far, and too many people had been there to hear them. The young woman who had been left behind inside the diner wiped her eyes and pulled out her phone. She began dialing quickly, her hands trembling. "Mom, something's happening. They just took Daniel. Please, come fast." Her voice cracked with emotion. Everyone nearby heard her call him Daniel. That name would soon spread across town, attached to the story that would ignite outrage far beyond the diner's walls. Chief Harker, still outside, barked orders to his officers, but he didn't notice the glowing phone screens inside. He didn't care who was watching. He believed he was untouchable, that his word was law, and that no video or protest could change that. He had spent decades building his power, and in his mind, one late-night scene in a diner would be forgotten by morning. But the people inside knew differently. They had seen too much, and his careless words, "Your right to remain silent means nothing here," were already echoing in their minds like a warning bell. The police car door slammed, and Daniel was pushed inside. The sound rang out in the quiet night, sharp and final. The chief climbed in another car, signaling his officers to follow. Within minutes, the flashing lights faded down the street, leaving behind only stunned silence at the diner. Slowly, people began to speak again, their voices filled with a mix of shock and determination. "We can't let this slide," the older man said firmly. "He's gone too far." The waitress nodded, tears in her eyes. "For years, we all kept quiet. But tonight, he said it himself, rights mean nothing to him. We can't stay silent anymore." As the diner's neon light buzzed above them, every customer inside realized they had just witnessed the start of something much bigger than a single arrest. They hadn't only seen a man taken away, they had seen arrogance laid bare, captured on camera, and about to be shared with the world. By the next morning, Crestwood was no longer the quiet little town it had been the night before. The video from the diner had already begun to spread across social media. What started as a shaky recording from a teenager's phone soon appeared on multiple platforms, shared and reshared thousands of times. The words spoken by Chief Ronald Harker, "Your right to remain silent means nothing here," were played again and again, shocking people everywhere who heard them. The arrogance in his voice and the look of fear on the young man's face told a story stronger than any caption could. In living rooms, offices, and coffee shops, people leaned over their phones and laptops, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some couldn't believe it had happened in their town, while others admitted they had suspected something like this for years. The diner customers who had witnessed it firsthand knew they had been part of a turning point. One by one, they began uploading their own videos, each showing the same scene from different angles. Soon, the incident wasn't just a rumor or a single clip, it was undeniable evidence. At the heart of the storm was Daniel, the young man taken away by the chief. His parents were stunned when they saw the video online. They had rushed to the station the night before after his friend called them, but they had been turned away with no explanation. His father, a school teacher, and his mother, a nurse, had always believed in fairness and justice. Seeing their son shoved against a car by the man who was supposed to protect the community filled them with anger and fear. They immediately contacted a lawyer, determined not to let the matter slide. Daniel's story began to spread alongside the video. News reports quickly revealed that he was not just an ordinary young man, he was a law student, studying constitutional law. The irony was not lost on anyone. A student who had dedicated himself to learning about rights and justice had been told in front of witnesses that his rights meant nothing. This fact gave the story even greater power, and more people began to demand answers from the police department. Meanwhile, at the Crestwood Diner, reporters crowded the parking lot. The waitress who had served Daniel that night found herself interviewed by 3 different news stations in a single afternoon. Her hands shook as she described the scene, but her voice was steady. He didn't do anything wrong, she told them. They were just eating like everyone else. The chief came in and treated him like a criminal for no reason. Her words echoed across television screens, further fueling outrage. The young woman who had been with Daniel also spoke to the press. With tears in her eyes, she described how helpless she had felt as she watched her friend dragged away. I begged him to stop. I told him Daniel hadn't done anything. But he didn't listen. He just looked at me like I didn't matter. Her voice cracked, and cameras captured the pain and fear in her expression. Viewers across the country could feel her sincerity. She wasn't an activist or a politician, she was just an ordinary person telling the truth about what she saw. Back at the police department, Chief Harker remained unshaken. He dismissed the growing outrage as a bunch of noise from people who don't understand real law enforcement. In a press conference, he stood tall at the podium, his chest puffed out, and declared that he had acted properly. I will not apologize for keeping order, he said firmly. This town depends on me to make tough choices, and sometimes that means saying things people don't want to hear. He smirked when asked about his controversial words, brushing them off as if they were meaningless. His arrogance was plain for all to see, and his refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of his actions only poured fuel on the fire. Citizens who had once been silent began to speak out. Old stories started to surface. A shop owner told a local reporter how Harker had threatened to shut down his store after he questioned an unfair ticket. A retired officer admitted that he had seen the chief humiliate younger policemen in public. Neighbors remembered times when Harker had spoken down to them, always reminding everyone of his power. None of those stories had ever gained much attention before, but now, with the diner video in everyone's mind, people started to connect the dots. It became clear that this incident wasn't an isolated moment, it was part of a long pattern of abuse. Outside the police station, people began to gather. At first, it was just a few protesters holding signs that read "Justice for Daniel" and "Rights Matter." But as the days went by, the crowd grew larger. By the end of the week, dozens stood outside each day, chanting, holding banners, and calling for Harker to be removed. The protests were peaceful but powerful. Their voices carried through the streets, echoing into City Hall where officials could no longer pretend to ignore what was happening. National news outlets picked up the story. Suddenly, Crestwood was no longer a small town tucked away from the spotlight. Headlines spread across the country, each one focused on the chief's shocking words. Commentators debated the meaning of his statement, and legal experts explained why his behavior was a dangerous abuse of power. Civil rights organizations began to call Crestwood City Council, urging them to take action. Daniel, released after several hours in custody, returned home shaken but determined. Reporters surrounded his house, asking for interviews. At first, he stayed quiet, speaking only to his family and his lawyer. But eventually, he agreed to make a short statement outside his home. Standing on the porch, wearing a simple shirt and jeans, he spoke with calm dignity. "I did nothing wrong," he said. "I was eating dinner with my friend when I was treated like a criminal. I was told my rights meant nothing. But rights do matter, they matter to every single one of us. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who believes in fairness." His words struck a chord, and his calm tone contrasted sharply with the chief's arrogant speeches. As the community rallied behind Daniel, pressure on the city government grew. The mayor, who had always supported Harker, began to face difficult questions. At first, he tried to defend the chief, saying, "He has served this town for decades and has made many tough decisions." But as more videos and testimonies surfaced, it became harder to stand by him. City council members, once hesitant, now demanded a formal investigation. Behind closed doors, they argued late into the night about what to do. At the same time, young people in Crestwood found themselves inspired. High school students created posters, college students organized rallies, and families came out to join the demonstrations. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore, it was about the kind of town they wanted Crestwood to be. No one wanted to live in a place where someone in uniform could declare that rights meant nothing. The message spread far beyond Crestwood. Ordinary people could not be silenced. Chief Harker, however, refused to step back. He walked through the station with the same swagger as always, convinced that the storm would blow over. He told his officers not to worry, promising them that things like this fade away in a week. But this time, he was wrong. His words had gone too far, and the people of Crestwood were no longer willing to look the other way. What had started as a late-night meal in a diner had now become the spark for a movement. Everyone in town could feel the shift. The air carried tension, but also hope. For the first time in years, people believed that change was possible. The chief thought his power made him untouchable, but the growing unity of his community was proving otherwise. And though Harker still stood at the podium, still dismissing questions and mocking critics, the truth was clear: he was no longer in control of the story. The people were. The days that followed brought even more attention to Crestwood. The small town, once known only to its residents, was suddenly on the front page of newspapers across the state. News vans lined the streets near City Hall, and reporters carried microphones through neighborhoods, asking people what they thought about the police chief's words. Everyone seemed to have a story, and one by one, those stories began to paint a much larger picture of Chief Ronald Harker than anyone outside of Crestwood had ever seen. It started with a local journalist named Megan Willis. She had been covering small-town news for years: school events, local sports, council meetings, but now she had a story that demanded investigation. With a notebook in her hand and determination in her eyes, Megan began asking around. She visited shops, knocked on doors, and interviewed people who had lived in Crestwood for decades. What she uncovered was shocking, but not surprising to those who lived under Harker's rule. A retired police officer, who preferred not to give his name at first, admitted that Harker had always been quick-tempered. "I worked with him for 15 years, he told her quietly over coffee. He didn't just enforce the law, he used it like a weapon. If you didn't follow his way, you paid for it. I saw him yell at young officers, belittle them in front of the entire team, and threaten their jobs if they questioned him." He paused, sighing heavily. "We all knew he crossed the line sometimes, but no one wanted to be the one to stand up against him." Megan took careful notes. She knew one testimony was not enough, but soon others followed. A store owner recalled how Harker had once walked in and demanded free supplies for the station. When the owner refused, he suddenly found himself facing endless inspections and fines. A woman in her 50s described how her teenage son had been stopped repeatedly by Harker for no reason, just because the chief didn't like the way he dressed. The more Megan dug, the more she realized this wasn't a matter of one bad night in a diner. This was a long history of unchecked arrogance. As Megan's articles hit the local paper and were shared online, the state press picked them up. Soon, investigative teams from bigger outlets arrived in town, asking the same questions. Each interview revealed a little more of the truth, and each voice that spoke out gave courage to others. People who had once stayed silent out of fear now felt that the moment had come to finally share their experiences. Inside City Hall, the pressure mounted. The mayor, who had stood by Harker for years, was growing restless. His phone rang constantly with calls from angry citizens, and emails flooded his office. At a council meeting, members argued fiercely over what to do. Some still believed Harker had given too many years of service to be removed so quickly, but others insisted that the evidence of misconduct was too great to ignore. The council chambers filled with citizens demanding accountability, their chants echoing through the building. "We want justice. We want change," they cried, refusing to be silenced. The Department of Justice also began to take notice. When civil rights groups filed formal complaints, federal investigators were dispatched to Crestwood. Their task was clear: review the video, examine Harker's record, and determine whether his behavior had violated constitutional rights. Their presence alone sent shockwaves through the department. Officers who had once felt loyal to Harker now found themselves questioned by outsiders. Some began to realize that their silence might soon be seen as complicity. For Daniel, the young law student, this was both overwhelming and affirming. He had become a symbol in a matter of days, though he never asked for the spotlight. When reporters asked how he felt about the growing investigations, he answered simply, "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. If my story can help others find their voice, then it's worth it." His quiet strength resonated with people, and more young residents looked up to him as an example of courage. Meanwhile, Chief Harker continued to act as though nothing could touch him. He still walked the halls of the police station with his usual air of authority. He called reporters meddling outsiders and accused protesters of exaggerating. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Officers whispered among themselves in the break room, some expressing regret over staying silent for so long. One younger officer admitted privately that he had never agreed with Harker's methods but had been too afraid to challenge him. He had the power to end careers with a single word, the officer said. "When you live under that kind of pressure, you keep your head down. But maybe we should have spoken up sooner." As these hidden truths came to light, the town's sense of unity grew stronger. Neighbors who rarely spoke to each other before were now working together to organize peaceful marches. Teachers, shopkeepers, students, and families all carried signs, their voices rising as one. What began as whispers of complaint had turned into a chorus of determination. Crestwood was no longer afraid of Harker's authority. The town was ready to demand change. One evening, Megan released an article that shook the town even further. She had discovered old complaints filed against Harker that had been buried in department records. Citizens had written letters years ago about unfair treatment, intimidation, and abuse of power. But each time, the complaints had mysteriously disappeared, dismissed without action. Now, with copies of the documents in hand, Megan showed how the system had protected him for years. The article spread like wildfire, proving that this was not just about one mistake but a pattern hidden for decades. Harker's arrogance, once his shield, was now his downfall. Every time he spoke in public, his words were scrutinized. When he mocked the protests, calling them childish tantrums, the clip spread online within hours, sparking even more outrage. People no longer saw him as a leader, they saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power. The mayor could no longer ignore it. In private meetings, he pressed Harker to step down voluntarily, hoping to avoid further embarrassment. But Harker refused. "I built this department," he growled. "I won't walk away because of some noisy crowd." His pride blinded him to the reality that his career was hanging by a thread. By the end of the week, the Department of Justice investigators held a press conference. They confirmed that they were reviewing multiple complaints and past cases connected to Harker. The announcement was met with cheers from the crowd gathered outside City Hall. For the first time in years, the people of Crestwood felt that justice might finally be within reach. At home, Daniel watched the coverage with his family. He felt the weight of everything that had happened, but also a glimmer of hope. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "You didn't ask for this, but maybe this was meant to happen. Maybe this is how change begins." Daniel nodded, knowing that his small act of courage in asking a simple question at the diner had become the spark for something much greater. And as the sun set over Crestwood that night, the town seemed different. It was still the same place with the same streets and familiar faces, but the silence that had once allowed arrogance to thrive was broken. The truth was out, and it was spreading. Harker's past, once hidden in shadows, was now being brought into the light, piece by piece, by voices that would no longer be ignored. The courtroom was packed with people who wanted to see what would happen next. For the first time, Chief Ronald Harker was no longer in control of the room. Instead of standing tall in uniform and giving orders, he was seated at a long wooden table, his expression hard and unyielding. Across from him sat Daniel with his lawyer, calm but focused, ready to show the truth. The lawsuit had drawn national attention, and reporters filled the benches, their pens and cameras ready to capture every detail. The air was thick with anticipation. When Daniel first stepped into the courthouse, he felt nervous. His parents walked beside him, offering quiet support, while his lawyer reassured him that the facts were on their side. He wasn't just representing himself anymore, he carried the voices of many others who had once been silenced by Harker's authority. Outside, protesters held signs and chanted, their voices echoing through the courthouse doors. "Justice for Daniel," they cried. "Accountability now." Their determination gave him courage. The trial opened with Daniel's lawyer presenting the diner video to the court. The shaky footage appeared on a large screen, showing the exact moment when Harker declared, "Your right to remain silent means nothing here." The words rang out across the silent courtroom, forcing everyone to hear them again. Gasps filled the room as the judge's eyes narrowed. There was no denying what had been said, it was clear, loud, and chilling. When it was Harker's turn to respond, he leaned forward, his voice dripping with defiance. "I was doing my job. People don't understand what it's like to keep order. Sometimes you need to make statements that get through to troublemakers. That young man was questioning my authority. I put him in his place." His tone shocked even those who had expected arrogance. He didn't apologize, didn't soften his words, he doubled down. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him, but Harker pressed on. "If I hadn't spoken like that, he would have thought he could challenge the law. Rights are not a shield for disobedience." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. Daniel's lawyer stood up calmly and asked, "So you believe rights can be dismissed whenever you feel it's necessary?" Harker smirked, shrugging his shoulders. "When it comes to keeping order, yes. Sometimes rights need to take a backseat." That single statement hung in the air like a storm cloud. It was the moment everyone would remember. The judge struck her gavel to restore order as the room erupted in murmurs. Daniel sat quietly, his eyes fixed on Harker. This was exactly what he and so many others had known about the chief, his belief that power was more important than justice. Now, the whole country could see it too. Over the next few days, the courtroom became the stage for a powerful reckoning. Witnesses came forward, one after another, to tell their stories. The waitress from the diner described how terrified she felt when she saw Daniel being dragged away. "He didn't fight back," she explained softly. "He just asked a simple question, and the chief snapped at him. I'll never forget those words. Her testimony brought many in the room to tears. Then came the store owner, who told his story of unfair treatment after refusing to give the chief free goods. His voice shook with emotion as he admitted how helpless he had felt. "I thought he could ruin my business if I stood up to him. So I stayed quiet. But now, I want the truth out." One by one, people who had once been silent found the strength to speak, and each story added weight to the growing case against Harker. Even officers who had once worked under him stepped forward. A young patrolman, his uniform crisp and his hands trembling, admitted he had seen Harker cross the line many times. "I wanted to say something," he confessed, "but I was scared. He told us if we ever questioned him, we'd lose our jobs. I couldn't afford that, so I kept my mouth shut. But I can't anymore. He doesn't represent what this badge should stand for." His courage inspired others, and soon more testimonies poured in. The Department of Justice representatives sat in the back, taking notes. Their presence reminded everyone that this was bigger than a small-town scandal. It was a matter of constitutional rights. If a police chief could declare that rights meant nothing, what did that say about the system that allowed him to stay in power for so long? The question weighed heavily on the minds of everyone watching. Outside the courthouse, protests grew larger every day. What started as a few dozen voices had swelled into hundreds. Families carried banners, students led chants, and community leaders gave speeches about the importance of accountability. Television cameras captured it all, sending the message far beyond Crestwood. Across the country, people began to discuss the case as a symbol of what happens when authority goes unchecked. Inside, Daniel showed remarkable composure. Each time he was asked to speak, he remained calm, respectful, and clear. He didn't raise his voice or insult Harker, he simply told the truth. "I asked if I had the right to remain silent," he explained to the court. "It was a fair question, something anyone could ask. His response told me that my rights and the rights of everyone else didn't matter to him. That's not how the law is supposed to work. That's not what justice is supposed to be." His words carried a power that no arrogance could defeat. As the trial progressed, the chief's support began to crumble. The mayor, once his ally, was now avoiding the cameras. City council members who had defended him were suddenly silent. Even his own officers stopped standing by his side in public. Each new day revealed more of the truth, and each new revelation chipped away at his once untouchable authority. The final blow came when Daniel's lawyer played recordings from past complaints, showing how Harker had dismissed people who questioned him. In one recording, his voice was heard saying, "If you think you have rights, you're wrong. I decide what happens in this town." The courtroom fell silent. It was the confirmation everyone needed. This was not a one-time mistake, this was a mindset that had defined his leadership for years. The judge called for order again, but the damage was done. The chief's own words had become the evidence that condemned him. Even those who had once admired his toughness now saw the danger of his arrogance. No one could defend him anymore. By the time the court recessed, it was clear where the case was heading. The Department of Justice announced it was formally investigating violations of constitutional rights, and the city council prepared for an emergency vote on Harker's position. The man who had once believed himself untouchable was now cornered, his pride and stubbornness leaving him with no allies. That evening, as Daniel walked out of the courthouse with his family, the crowd erupted in cheers. They held signs high and chanted his name, not as a hero who sought glory, but as a symbol of courage and truth. He smiled softly, humbled by their support. His mother whispered to him, "This is what happens when people stand together." Across town, Harker sat alone in his office, staring at the walls. For years, he had controlled the narrative, silenced opposition, and bent the rules to his will. But now, the very words he had used to intimidate had turned against him. "Your right to remain silent means nothing here" had become the line that defined his downfall. No amount of denial could erase it. As night fell on Crestwood, the town buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew that the next steps would determine not only the future of one man but also the future of their community. The arrogance that once kept people silent had been broken, and the truth was finally being spoken aloud for the world to hear. The announcement came on a cloudy Monday morning. The mayor of Crestwood stepped up to a podium outside City Hall, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd of citizens, reporters, and protesters. Cameras flashed as he unfolded a prepared statement. For weeks, the town had waited for this moment, and now it had finally arrived. The mayor cleared his throat and began, after careful consideration and in light of overwhelming evidence, the city council has voted unanimously to remove Chief Ronald Harker from his position, effective immediately. The crowd erupted in cheers. People clapped, hugged, and waved their signs triumphantly. For many, it felt like a heavy weight had been lifted. The man who once seemed untouchable was no longer in charge. His words, once barked with arrogance and fear, had led to his own downfall. Inside the police department, the announcement hit like a storm. Officers gathered in silence as the news spread through the halls. Some felt relief, others looked uneasy, still processing what it meant. For younger officers, it was the chance to finally work without fear of constant intimidation. For veterans, it was the end of an era they had long endured. The department, once ruled by one man's iron grip, now faced the difficult task of rebuilding trust with the community. As reporters rushed to cover every angle, attention shifted to Daniel. He hadn't sought fame, but his courage had made him the central figure of the story. When journalists asked for his reaction, he spoke calmly and with humility. "This isn't about me," he said. "This is about justice. It's about showing that no one is above the law, not even the people meant to enforce it. This is proof that rights do matter." His words, spoken with sincerity, spread across news networks and inspired people far beyond Crestwood. For his parents, the moment was bittersweet. They were proud of their son's bravery, but they also wished he had never been put in such a situation. His mother held his hand as she whispered, "I'm glad it's over, Daniel. You stood tall when it mattered most." His father added softly, "You showed everyone that one voice can make a difference." Meanwhile, Harker himself sat in a quiet office, packing the last of his belongings into a box. His uniform hung neatly on the wall, but it no longer carried the power it once had. He looked tired, his face lined with frustration and disbelief. For decades, he had believed he was the law in Crestwood. Now, he was just another man stripped of authority. He muttered under his breath, blaming the media, the protesters, and anyone but himself. Yet deep down, he knew the truth. His own words had betrayed him. The Department of Justice continued its investigation, reviewing every complaint filed during his years in office. Lawsuits piled up, each one brought forward by citizens who had been too afraid to speak before. Some cases were small, involving intimidation or harassment, but others were serious and carried the possibility of heavy penalties. Harker faced not only the loss of his job but also the reality of legal consequences. The arrogance that had shielded him for so long was now gone, leaving him exposed. Back in Crestwood, the town began to heal. The protests outside City Hall turned into celebrations. Families gathered with banners, children drew chalk messages of justice wins on sidewalks, and neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now shared stories of relief and hope. For the first time in years, the community felt united. They had proven that standing together could bring about change. The police department introduced a temporary leader, a respected officer from another district known for fairness and honesty. His first action was to meet with citizens and listen to their concerns. "We can't undo the past," he admitted openly, "but we can build a future based on trust. This department belongs to the people of Crestwood, not to one man." His words were met with cautious optimism. People knew it would take time, but they also knew the door to reform was finally open. Daniel returned to his studies, but life was no longer the same. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, thanking him for his bravery. Strangers shook his hand, calling him an inspiration. At first, the attention felt overwhelming, but he handled it with the same calmness that had carried him through the trial. He reminded everyone that it wasn't about being a hero, it was about standing up for what was right. His dream of becoming a lawyer now carried even greater meaning. He wanted to use his future career to protect others from experiencing the same injustice he had faced. His friend, the young woman who had been with him at the diner, also found her voice. Once shy and quiet, she now spoke at community gatherings, encouraging others to stand up against abuse of power. "I saw what happened," she told crowds. "I saw how fear can freeze you in place. But I also saw how courage can break that fear. We don't have to be silent anymore." Her words, filled with honesty and emotion, inspired many to believe in their own ability to create change. The diner itself became something of a landmark. Tourists stopped by to see the place where the story began. The waitress, once shaken by what she had witnessed, now served coffee with a smile, proud to have been part of the movement for justice. She often told visitors, "This is where silence ended. This is where people realized their voices mattered." As weeks turned into months, the story of Crestwood spread into classrooms, law schools, and civic discussions. Professors taught it as an example of why accountability in law enforcement is essential. Students debated what it meant for rights, justice, and community. Across the country, people shared the lesson: authority is meant to serve, not to control. For Harker, life outside the badge was lonely. He lived in quiet isolation, no longer respected or feared. The man who once stood tall at press conferences now avoided public places altogether. Former allies no longer returned his calls, and those who once obeyed him without question had moved on. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when arrogance replaces duty. But for Crestwood, a new chapter had begun. The town that had once carried fear now carried hope. People walked with a little more confidence, knowing they had faced arrogance and defeated it. They remembered the words that once echoed in that diner, but now those words held a new meaning. Your right to remain silent means nothing here had been meant as intimidation. Instead, it became the spark that taught everyone their silence was dangerous, that speaking out was the only way to protect their rights. Daniel often thought about that night. He remembered the fear he felt when those words were spoken to him, and the disbelief that followed. But he also remembered the faces of people who stood up afterward, the strangers who held signs, the neighbors who told their stories, and the community that refused to stay quiet. He realized that sometimes, the darkest moments give rise to the brightest change. As the sun set one evening, Daniel sat on his porch with his parents. The air was calm, and the sounds of children playing filled the neighborhood. His father leaned back in his chair and said, "This town feels different now." Daniel nodded slowly, watching the horizon glow with soft light. "It is different," he replied. "It finally found its voice." And so, the story of Crestwood came to an end, not with silence but with strength. A chief who believed he was above the law had fallen, and in his place rose a community that knew its rights mattered. The lesson would not be forgotten. No matter how powerful one person might seem, the truth and the courage of many could always be stronger.